I was just telling Randy that the first time I talked about this particular piece of work, it was actually at a Microsoft research lab. I walked into the room and suddenly went, oh boy, all the wrong people are in the audience today. All the people who actually know about spreadsheets. So it's always nice to be here and have an opportunity to come visit and talk to this audience. And I was realizing the other day, it's I think about 4 years since I was last here. And when I was last here, I was talking about some work on databases that was it was a, sort of the beginning of a project that is not now over, but is reaching a waypoint. In that it's been a book project, and I just shipped off the last piece of the book, the index, to MIT Press a couple of weeks ago, and it's due out in April. So what I want to do, I'm mainly going to give you today one of the case studies that anchors that book project on the materialities of information. But I'll start off by trying to sort of contextualize that by sort of giving a sort of broader account of the book project. So for those of you who were in the room around about 4 years ago when I was last here, there's a little bit of repetition, but I promise we'll get past that. So the materialities of information is sort of the central notion or provocation that this project has been exploring. And it is while I think we can identify different kind of pieces of that might be, as a starting point, the reason I call it a provocation is because, of course, so much of the dominant discourse of information is about dematerialization, about virtuality, about an independence from the physical world and its constraints. And those stories of the gradual substitution of bits for atoms are stories of dematerialization, accompanied often by slides like this, shadowy figures, seas of ones and zeros. And one of the few things that we can definitely say about the world, about virtuality, is that it's blue. I do not know whether this thing is always uniformly blue, but it is. And having for many years tried to find ones that weren't blue, I've now just given up, embraced it, and make it a feature. So in the context of that kind of rhetoric then, what is it that we might want a project on the materialities of information to talk about? And there are many different kind of routes into this. One that explore a little bit sort of comes from anthropology and material culture. So the people studying material culture in anthropology are have been in many ways responding to and reacting against a similar kind of narrative in anthropology, which is to focus on symbolism, on semantics, on meaning, that often divorces it from the material world. And people in material culture have tried to pull back and focus on the way that objects that we carry with us, objects that have different kinds of properties, carry those symbolic meanings. And the symbolic meanings are deeply entwined with the properties of objects, with their fragility, with their robustness, with their luster, and so forth. And so one thing that a materiality of information could be is a study of the ways in which objects, particular kinds of digital objects, information objects, come to have particular kind of meaning for us. What I occasionally, in the context of this slide, refer to as why iPods were cool and students were not. Although Randy was actually the first person ever in my various versions of this talk to ever recognize what that cool is, the guy has tattooed upon it. So that's actually not what I'm going to talk about. Similarly, one of the other ways in which we recognize the material consequences of information infrastructures is the ways in which they shape our world and our experience of the world. This is a photograph that my colleague Genevieve L took somewhere in the northern parts of South Australia. It always makes me think, first of all, I can't tell whether that sign is informational or a warning. And secondly, and I'm not sure if you can see it in this room, but the swerving tire tracks on the road that seems to have engendered are kind of interesting as well. Although any of you who've ever driven around the outback in Australia will know much more sense of this sort of stuff. So this focuses on the way in which our proximity in the early 21st century to high-speed internet connections may be as important as proximity to the road network was in the 20th, or the railway network was in the 19th. The internet has to be in places, and it shapes those places, and it shapes our encounter with those places. So that a focus on materialities through spatial arrangements. We could approach the materialities of information from a sort of like resource perspective, thinking about the fact that those apparently immaterial virtual resources that we consume, whether they're virtual movies or virtual environments, nonetheless must somewhere be realized in large hunks of iron and silicon, in enormous amounts of power and cooling that have to be managed, that have to be placed somewhere in particular, and so forth. So the very physicality, the brute materiality, as I call it sometimes, of information infrastructures is one part. And then we might also focus on the kinds of, from a sort of like Marxist materials perspective, think about the concentrations of power, the concentrations of economic resource that it also requires to produce particular kinds of arrangements. I'm sure most people in this room know what this building is. Okay, fine, so I don't need to tell you all that. Although I always do find interesting as you're wandering around that part of downtown LA that you can actually hear this building from 2 or 3 blocks away. You can hear the roar of its air conditioning over the noise of regular downtown traffic. And since I started using that building as an example, just a couple of years ago, it set the new record in the downtown core for for real estate prices by square foot. Mainly because it's actually it's cubic feet that really matter in that building, not square feet. So here's the thing. These are all different kinds of ways into thinking about the materialities of information. They're useful routes. They are things that different kind of groups of people have explored. But they do tend, by and large, to focus on information infrastructures. And I'm not so much interested here in information infrastructures or even in informational objects. I'm interested in information itself, digital information itself, as something that has multiple materializations and whose materializations matter for us. And the example I sort of, the quote, the notion I draw upon is one from Dourish, design educator at MIT, who talks about design practice as a reflective conversation with materials. And when he says that, it's a very sort of evocative phrase, and it sort of instantly does call to mind pictures like this. Somebody throwing a pot, the way in which the potter has an artistic goal that needs to be produced in conversation with the materials. Certain aspects of that artistic goal may be easily realizable with the materials at hand. Some may not. The material itself, by the way in which it resists one's will, may suggest alternatives or possibilities. And the form that emerges at the end is neither purely the will of the artist, nor purely the consequence of the materials, but a conversation between the two. And I began to ask myself the question, what are the materials with which those of us who design digital systems are engaged in a reflective conversation? Because I think we do have a sense, a visceral sense, that there is a material that bends to our will to some extent, but resists it in others, that obstructs the paths that by which we imagine we're going to be able to achieve particular kinds of results, that suggests opportunities in itself, that shapes the production of digital experience by its very materiality. And so I think we can pick up this notion of reflective conversation with materials and recognize, use it, not import it into the digital, but rather use it to recognize the materialities of the digital, the materialities of digital information, the kinds of things that we can do with it. People who study human-computer interaction or distributed or external cognition are familiar with some of the consequences of our ways of thinking about representations. And this is a sort of standard example that people use, not so much in the digital, but certainly in the sort of the representational domain. And so if I ask you to multiply two numbers, it's pretty straightforward. We have a rote procedure that we teach to kids in grade school about how to multiply numbers together. It's based on breaking that down into simple steps that exploit the positional system of Indo-Arabic numerals with which we're used to working. But we know that if I give you that as Roman numerals, the process is much more complicated. There is no rote procedure by which I can do the calculation, not least because what the glyphs mean is not independent of the whole, right? So just the ways the numbers work that makes it impossible for us to specify a procedure in quite the same way that we can with Indo-Arabic numerals. And so what we see here is that the sort of the material form, just in this case, how the representation manifests itself as a series of marks on paper. And marks on paper that can then be examined, manipulated, moved, and so forth, has a remarkable and direct consequence on the kinds of things that we expect that we can do with that information. I'm inspired too by some work that's gone on in the psychology of programming. So there's work done by Thomas Green, Ariane Petrie, Alan Blackwell, and others on what they call the cognitive dimensions of notations. And they've applied this to a variety of notations, but the primary notation they care about are programming languages. And they ask themselves the question, when people are learning to write computer programs, what kinds of mistakes do they make and why? And one set of errors that you can make when learning to program are a series of conceptual errors about the fundamental sort of like concepts of imperative or functional programming, object-oriented programming, or whatever. But they also identified a variety of errors that people make, which are errors that are consequences of the manipulation of representations and the difficulty of mapping a conceptual idea into a lexical idea. In particular, if I make changes to a program, if I want to add a parameter, if I want to add a level of indirection, if I want to turn something from a scalar property into a vector property, how many places in a piece of text do I have to change? How many lines do I need to change? How easy is it for me to accidentally change one line one way and another line another way? What kinds of possibilities for inconsistency arise? And they started to analyze the kinds of mistakes that people made when learning to program in languages like Prolog, in languages like C, helping me program us by learning C, but Java, and so forth, and begin to identify relationships between the kinds of errors that people make in these notational properties, cognitive dimensions. And this is another way of thinking about the materialities here, or another manifestation of the materialities, which is that a computer program, as with any kind of representation inside the digital system, manifests itself somewhere as something like this that has to be worked on, that has to be worked over, that has to be maintained with particular kinds of constraints that go beyond what the notation can itself support. But it's those constraints that map between the notation and our conceptualization. So that's sort of the broad motivation that sort of set me off down this path. And the stuff that sort of has come out has been, in the book, is anchored by a variety of case studies. One of them is the database work that I talked about here a few years ago. I want to tell you today instead about work on spreadsheets, which sort of arose almost accidentally and came out of an ethnographic project that was focused on a very different kind of domain, but sort of really sparked our imagination. Now, as I was preparing this talk, I discovered, has anybody seen this video? I don't have the link, so I'm not going to do it. This is, this poor fellow encountered the materiality of spreadsheets in a very particular kind of way. There is a video on YouTube for your amusement and delight of this poor sod scrolling through opening an empty spreadsheet in Excel, and scrolling all the way down to the bottom by use of the down arrow key on his keyboard. There being 1,048,000 rows in that empty spreadsheet, the process does take him 9 hours, 36 minutes. It's not for nothing that there's a bottle of 5-hour energy stuck there, and he has a video of the entire process. Riveting stuff. I must admit that I have not made it 9 hours and 36 minutes through the whole thing. But there's a fast forward. So, however, that's not quite the use of spreadsheets. But the spreadsheets, as it manifests itself there on a desktop computer, that's maybe what you imagine when you think about spreadsheets. It's certainly probably my major use of spreadsheets, not I think what I use of spreadsheets. But there's a slightly different kind of configuration that we encountered. And again, this came up as part of ethnographic work that I was doing with Janet Vertesi and Melissa Masmanian, Matt Beats, and others, where we were working up at the Jet Propulsion Lab studying large-scale science, and in particular the people who were flying the Cassini spacecraft around the Saturn system. And there's a lot of, as we know in large-scale science, there's a lot of meetings. And one might expect in those meetings that they operate pretty much like this one, a person in the front of the room and there's some PowerPoint or keynote slides behind them. That's a configuration that's been studied reasonably often. But in fact, what we found instead was this, that what would be presented at the front of the room was a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet is an object of work, a spreadsheet is an object of attention for this group gathered around it. And this is also, I think, a fairly familiar experience for many of us. Many of the faculty meetings I go to operate like this. Here we are doing graduate admissions at this time of year. There's a lot of rooms with spreadsheets at the front for us to work through. The work of program committees and journal editorial boards often takes this form as well. Now, there haven't been terribly many studies that I've been able to find of this kind of use of spreadsheets. There's lots of this. There's lots of studies of PowerPoint. I gave this version of this talk recently, used this slide, and somebody managed to grab a photograph of me standing in front of the slide doing exactly the same thing at the same time, which I could use instead, but then it just gets a little too complicated, too inward. So people standing in front of slides is a sort of like well-understood phenomenon. There's a number of interesting kind of ways that people have looked at that. So folk like Von Orlikowski and Joanne Yates at MIT have studied sort of the use of PowerPoint as a sort of as an organizational communication tool, and what kind of genres of organizational communication arise out of the particular use of PowerPoint, how it is that PowerPoint in particular gets used to communicate particular kinds of things, and how that sort of spreads around organizations. I've done a lot of work with people over the years at Intel. One of the curious things I found about Intel was that the standard document format inside Intel for anything is a PowerPoint deck. Your performance appraisal is a PowerPoint deck. Your project proposal is a PowerPoint deck. Even if nobody will ever stand up at the front of the room and give the slides, nonetheless, everything must be fitted into slides and bullet points and organized in a PowerPoint deck. So the idea of the kind of genre working that goes on around PowerPoint may extend beyond presentations, but it speaks a lot to how information sort of circulates around organizations. This guy, Hubert Noblat, who's a conversation analyst, ethnomethodologist, has this interesting group that's focused particularly on people giving PowerPoint presentations. How it is that spoken language gets reorganized around the bullet points, how rooms have to be configured, the very fact that we're sitting all here in the semi-darkness, in order to allow a PowerPoint presentation to proceed effectively. And the movement of people in the room, the fact that I'm caught between talking to the audience, checking my slides, making sure the right things come up on the screen, all those kinds of things. So there's been a bunch of work of that sort, and some other interesting stuff that I'll refer to a little later on. But not nearly so much on the presentation spreadsheets. There is some good stuff on spreadsheets. It's sort of in two sources. One is there's nice work on spreadsheet errors. most spreadsheets, it turns out, if you think of a spreadsheets as sort of end-user programs, they're basically computer programs written by people with no training in writing computer programs and with no debugging tools. And so the fact that so many spreadsheets have errors on them is perhaps not surprising. What might be a little more surprising or horrifying, depending on your perspective, is the consequences of those errors when you think about the kinds of places that spreadsheets get used. And some of you might have seen there's an interesting debate and back and forth over a bug that was uncovered in a spreadsheet that was the basis of an analysis that was published in an economics journal, which was actually the academic basis for austerity policies implemented in the EU. And it turns out, somebody had just stopped dragging at some point and failed to get the last 8 items on the list, which would have changed their analysis quite dramatically. Completely undermined the economic and numerical argument for austerity. So spreadsheet errors, turns out we're living with them in ways more consequential than we might realize. There are also, and I'll sort of get back to this a little later on, there's also some interesting work on spreadsheets as the progenitors of organizational, or repositories of organizational knowledge, if you will. Many of the processes that we engage in organizations may begin by taking last year's spreadsheets and taking all the data out of it and then filling it into this year's data, right? So the spreadsheet that was built for some particular purpose then becomes essentially the encoding of the routine and the process that we then will engage in over time. So sort of documents become records, records become templates, templates become businesses. However, I'm more interested in actually picking up on what Hubert Noblow calls PowerPoint events. That is the moment of somebody presenting these slides. I'm more interested in spreadsheet events and thinking about how it is that the form of the spreadsheet contributes or helps shape the organizational practices. This is another shot from NASA. Let's say we found these kind of meetings happening a lot. There's an interesting thing here with the fact that the spreadsheets on the screen, the spreadsheets are also on people's computers, and I'm going to come back to that one in a little bit. But it's clear that there are many tools that they could use for this job, and the spreadsheet is offering them particular kinds of arrangements that must have some kind of value for the organization, and we're sort of interested in what. What is it about the spreadsheet as a material form and the constraints that it comes with that allows organizations to operate in effective ways? Or what are the features around which organizations have chosen to organize themselves? I'm going to talk about this in terms of three sort of fundamental notions. The grid, formula, and the trajectory. And so we'll start with grid and formula, which are going all the way back to basics. So here's my spreadsheet. And I open it up at first. Is it first? Yes, 1A. And since I have never engaged in the process of scrolling all the way down to the bottom, never tried that, but it starts off like this. And the important thing to say about this is the spreadsheet never starts blank. The spreadsheet only ever starts empty. It already comes pre-committed to a particular kind of structural arrangement, the grid. And this grid, of course, reproduces, right? We can talk about spreadsheets now, but once upon a time we called them electronic spreadsheets because they're by contrast to paper spreadsheets, which were themselves gridded. But they come already with this notion that we all expect of a grid as the fundamental organizing principle. There are, it should be said, some spreadsheets that don't use grids quite as structurally as this. They use like Apple's numbers, it's slightly different, but nonetheless, within Apple's numbers, when you actually want to put anything in, it goes into a grid form. The importance of the grid, as far as I'm concerned here, is that it speaks not only to sort of like orientation and organization, but also to granularity. And it's the granularity that the grid imposes upon the data that's really important. Once I start to put data into the spreadsheet, once I start filling out the empty spreadsheet, fill up an empty spreadsheet to put things in cells. And I immediately have to decide what is the granularity of the thing that's going to go into a cell. What's the granularity of the thing that's going to go into a row? What's the granularity of the thing that's going to go into a column, which are basically the only three things I get to manipulate. And one of the features, one reason this granularity is important is that you can't refactor a spreadsheet, or at least it's a huge monstrous pain in the ass, right? You can't really change your mind later about the granularity. Once you've filled out your spreadsheet, you're kind of committed to that structure, to come and sort of reorganize things in a way that's going to sort of radically move them around. It would require a series of tools and technologies that are simply not provided to you. And so commitment to structuring turns out to be one of the fundamental consequences of the grid and the way in which the grid is materialized within the spreadsheet. Which, again, if we bear in mind the fact that I imagine my spreadsheet to be sort of one-time tool, something that I'm doing in order to solve a problem, but then that tool gets used the next year and the year after and the year after, and then I leave the organization and people start using the spreadsheet. There may be all sorts of consequences to that commitment to granularity. And similarly, when we think about these in sort of organizational settings, the fact that they're committed to particular kinds of granularity also shapes how it is that I might want to communicate, right? How I want to structure the interaction that goes on around the spreadsheet. The other thing that the grid does that we found to be tremendously important in these meetings is that it structures the temporal organization of the meeting in that the grid anticipates. When I come into a meeting and there's a spreadsheet on the board, I don't have to, I know how we're going to go through it. I don't know if I'm looking at this and we're going to go through it top to bottom or left to right, but I have a reasonable expectation that one of those is going to predominate at any given kind of moment. We're not going to deal with this cell and then that cell and then this cell and then scroll over the other side. And that's an important part of how it is that people are working here, is it's helping them to decide what it is that, or to recognize what it is that's going to happen. You know, in program committee meetings, I can see where I'm going to be involved. Hold on a second, I just need to find something here. So the anticipatory structure of the grid is really important, because here is the way the grid becomes interfunctioned with speech, with the organization of the meeting, with a tempo and a notion of how much there is to do here and how quickly we have to get through things. So the way in which the grid is laid out here, so this is like laying things out slide by slide. You've got no idea how many slides I have. But here, with the spreadsheet, you know exactly how many rows there are. You can see what's coming. You can interpret the consequences then for your own particular kind of action. I want to say something else about something else. So this is one of the spreadsheets taken from our work, and I'm going to tell you a story. This is not actually the spreadsheet from the story, but it's a good illustration. So the thing that sort of sparked us off in this stuff was a particular meeting, and the context of the meeting approximately is that it turns out that they don't have quite as much time or quite as much fuel for the spacecraft the next time it takes a pass on Enceladus to do all the science they had been hoping to do. And so, having already had a plan for what science was going to happen, that is, which sensors were going to be pointed at the moon, and when the spacecraft would rotate and do things, they suddenly found themselves having to replan, reprioritize, and drop some things off the schedule. As you can imagine, this is a very contentious kind of thing. If I'm coming to you and saying, you thought you were going to get a paper in Astrophysics Weekly next week on the basis of your gravitational readings, but you're not because you may get any gravitational readings, it's an issue. So the charge to the group was to go through this list. They had each column had been defined by one group or another and had a list of what they wanted to do, and then they had to color code it. And the idea was that everything would either be green or red. Green for go, red for no. You will see some green on this spreadsheet. You will see some red in the spreadsheet. You will see a lot of things that aren't either of those. So a little more yellow is like going towards the red, but perhaps not quite as orangey as that other one. There's a lot of decisions being made here that don't necessarily get manifested directly in the plan. Here's why I found that particularly interesting. is the point at which I got really nervous when I was giving a talk to Microsoft. Here's what I find really interesting. You can't sort by color. Now, you can group by color, so it, I had to listen again, I had to be careful when I was talking to Microsoft. But you can't sort by color. It's a very, it's not operative in quite the same way as other kinds of data are operative. And the decision to color cells, rather than, or columns, rather than say, to assign them a score between 1 and 10, suddenly comes to matter. Because one of those things can be operationalized, one of those things can be formularized, can be actually made into a formula, and the other one cannot. I can't compute things on the basis of how orangey a cell is. We can all see it, and we can talk about it, we can negotiate about it, but it can't be a feature of the spreadsheet as a data object itself. So the grid, certain things live within the grid in a sort of like deep sense, and certain things are on the grid but not necessarily in the grid in quite the same kind of way. The other thing that was important about that meeting was this idea that what they had going in, I just have a series of slides with like things that are not quite all green, right? What things that were going into it was that everybody had everyone had a column, every team had a column in the spreadsheet. So the rows are common things that everybody had to do. How much time is it going to take? What's the orientation of the spacecraft during that time? How much delta V is it going to cost us in order to get the spacecraft from one position to another? How long are we going to have to run the reaction wheels in order to get ourselves there? All those kinds of things. And every team has a different set of answers. And so every column, everyone produced a column that was like their description of their priorities that went into the spreadsheet, and it all gets sort of like assembled together. But notice here then, for the grid, the way in which they get assembled. The grid brings these things into alignment without collapsing them into each other. It holds everybody's data in the same format nearby. It shows its relationships to other people's data without collapsing it, without making them all the same. And that notion of alignment, a sort of a loose, maybe even an uncomfortable alignment between the data from different groups reflected something about the way in which the groups operated themselves. This was a group of people who, by and large, characterized their decision-making process by what makes everybody equally unhappy. But it's like, but that notion of the ways that things were aligned but not together seemed to characterize not only the spreadsheet but also the sort of organizational dynamics in really important ways. So the spreadsheet keeps things separated. The grid helps separate things that might otherwise all be collapsed together. And that separation, but within a sort of structure of alignment, is one of the ways in which these people manage to sort of make their stuff work. It wouldn't work that way for a series of PowerPoint presentations if we were going to give computer science. It wouldn't even work that way for a series of slides in a PowerPoint deck that makes your case or my case or the